excited to have Senator Yarbro with us, and you've been doing some very incredible work with regard to farmers and with regard to access to food. But before we get into that, do you want to tell the crowd just a little bit about yourself, maybe your upbringing and what brought you into politics?
Sure. So I'm Jeff Yarbro. I currently represent about 210,000 people in Nashville in the Tennessee State Senate. So our state Senate has 33 members, and we decide everything from education policy to the state budget to healthcare policy to agriculture policy. But I'm not one of those. There apparently are some people who are born and raised in Nashville. There aren't many, but there are some. I'm not one of them. I grew up in a small town called Dyersburg, which is in West Tennessee, about 180 miles west of here on the Mississippi River. My father, grandfather, and my whole family farmed in that part of the world growing up. So I spent summers, baling hay and building fences around cattle and doing that kind of work. And then I wanted to not do that anymore. And so did my undergraduate work at Harvard College, and then went to the University of Virginia for law school. And I moved back here to start to Tennessee and set up shop in Nashville, clerked for a judge, and started working in the law firm here in town. And then in around 2008 or so, I decided to run for office for the first time. And in 2010, I ran my first race. And the day I got in, I was running against a 40-year incumbent who put $300,000 of his own money into his campaign. The day I announced, I did not have $300,000 of my own money to put into the race. And he got the endorsements of the entire Senate Democratic Caucus, which is what I was running to join, and 38 of the 40 Metro Council members. But on election night, we worked really hard, especially this neighborhood is where our campaign headquarters was. And on election night, they declared me the winner by 2 votes. And then they called back an hour later and it was tied. And they called back an hour after that and I was down 2 votes with 2 provisional ballots outstanding. And then I won both those 2 provisional ballots. But in the meantime, they found 7 more absentee ballots. And it went on like this for a few days. And so I ended up losing that first race by 17 votes. And I always tell any group, especially student groups, this group would have been the margin plus, right? Like this class can decide elections or not class, but like this group, just one side of this room could have decided that election. And that's oftentimes the case in local government. But when you lose an election that close, your friends don't let you not run the second time. And so 4 years later, I was elected to that job and have been serving in the state Senate for the last 9 years. I've been the Democratic leader and caucus chair. I'm not right now. Currently I'm running to be the mayor of the city of Nashville. And if you're registered to vote here, I would love to ask for your votes. And if you're not, I would love to make sure that you do get registered between now and August. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Voter registration is a big deal, and obviously the young people in and around Nashville have become increasingly aware of sort of the political climate and some of the things going on. But on that front, before we really dig into Senate Bill 1049, in the world of politics around you, because I know you've kind of been involved in this for about 20 or so years now.
It's very sad when I hear about it like that, but yes.
Well, and forgive me, you started working for Senator Al Gore, correct? Or when Al Gore was running.
I was an intern for when he was vice president, and then when he started running for president, I was close by when they started running, and so I was very cheap. So.
How have you seen the way the political climate has changed, or maybe the way politics has evolved? What have you kind of noticed over that time?
Well, so I'll tell you. I think the Bush-Gore campaign in 2000 ends up being a relative turning point, which is very sad to me that y'all weren't alive then. But so in the 80s and 90s in the United States, on election night, there was no such thing as red states and blue states. Like CBS might put the Democrats in red and the Republicans in blue, while ABC had the Democrats in blue and Republicans in red. It was really been a kind of post-2000 development where everything is seen as red and blue. And I think right now we're living in this time of intense nationalization, right? I mean, and not to call anybody out, but like, how many more people know more about the Tennessee legislature this week than you ever have before? And why? Because it was on national news, not because like of what we cover in the media environment here. It's because it actually made the national news this week, and so now Tennesseans are paying attention, right? And that to me is the biggest change, because now we just have, our system is sort of designed so that you're supposed to fight over every piece of territory, and there's supposed to be unique races, but we now just have like one big 50-yard line for the country, and all the races are decided on this big national tribal sphere, and I think that makes all of us dumber and less helpful in terms of getting good government done.
Yeah, well, the good news is, though, that you did have a bill passed this week, just 2 days ago, that had bipartisan support.
Yes.
And is going to do a lot of good for the people of Nashville and people of Tennessee. Do you want to tell us a little bit about, because some of us have read up on it a little bit from the class that we're in, but I imagine a lot of the crowd is unfamiliar with Bill 10.
Sure, and this is a bill that sort of was brought to us by the farmers markets of Tennessee. There's an alliance of the farmer markets across the state, and which, I assume that, there's one that's 6 blocks from my house, but there are, I think, 7 in Nashville. There are around 50 that are part of the alliance across the state, and probably a lot more, really. But they're important gathering places for the community. They're important, opportunities for small business owners, and especially local farmers and growers, and entrepreneurs, frankly. And so they're just a huge part of our community and our economy. And they were facing this weird disparity in the law where things that were prepared food, like they couldn't sample they couldn't actually, just in there. And so it was weird, because if you were at a special event, like a concert or like a Bonnaroo type thing, you could have a venue that was passing out samples. But these farmers markets that were the same vendors showing up every week, like, could not. And so one of the things that we did is we basically set up a statewide system so that people who are going to be repeat players, basically, in the farmers market space, could do one permit that then, where they are doing their certifications with the health department at the state level, that gives them the authority to kind of lower that barrier so that they can reach more customers and be more competitive. And we also just made it easier for anyone who's following sort of sanitation rules to be able to use that experience. And it ended up being one of those things where, we started this, and we weren't sure if people were going to be interested in it or not, but then we had lots of people join in. Like, so the Farm Bureau that represents all of the farmers in the state, really got engaged, and lots of businesses that are excited about that space and the farm to table space, and just trying to improve those local community growth food areas, really got engaged in this legislation. And so we sort of, the other piece that I'm excited about here is it creates a kind of an anchor for farmers markets in the code book, and creates a sort of a legal infrastructure for them, which we hope can allow them to continue to grow and expand.
And so why do you think that a piece like this, which obviously I think to all of us, I think to plenty of other people, and there's a reason it received bipartisan support, it seems like a no-brainer piece of legislation. Why do you think it was a bipartisanly supported piece when there's so many things out there that perhaps we could see as being obvious or common sense? I think the great, the thing that most people don't see is that lots of the things that we actually pass are bipartisan, right? Like, especially if in the last 2 weeks I've done lots of interviews or shown up in press or media, and it's usually because we're talking about things where we're really fighting. And we are really fighting over trying to get something done with the covenant, in the aftermath of the covenant, and the tragedy there. And we're
obviously objecting, at least I was objecting to the expulsion of our members this week, which did make national news. And so usually it's the things that we're fighting about, like the ban on drag shows or the transgender healthcare issues, these things that fit into the culture war fight is what gets covered. The work that I do most, that's kind of the reason that I ran really in the first place, is the trying to pass policy like this bill. And most of the time you can actually get pretty good support across the aisle, because I usually describe this to people as the legislature is a group of 132 people who are kind of capable of solving problems as long as they don't fall into what I call the Fox News, MSNBC vortex. Because once an issue falls in that vortex, it is just red jerseys and blue jerseys, and there are not enough people in my colored jersey to get a lot done. And so usually our job is to try to pull things out of that tribal culture war space and make them real. And I was blown away, because I think we have this image of farmers markets as these kind of hipster urban kind of deals, and one of my Senate colleagues who represents probably the most rural district in the state, he has 12 counties, and he was like, oh, my farmers markets are very interested in this piece of legislation. And when it's something that's concrete that affects somebody that they represent, that's a great way for us to work together and get something done.
Sure.
And that's the sort of thing I always tell people, if you only read the newspaper, you would only know that I fought with the other side, and not that I've passed 80 pieces of legislation over the last 8 years.
Well, and so how does a bill like this escape that MSNBC, Fox News, red jersey, blue jersey vortex? Because I feel like we could make a compelling argument for most of the issues that are within that vortex and that have this partisan pull, that there's no reason for them to.
Right.
And obviously,
we actually struggled with that one for a little bit on this, because there's so much consternation in the House that they almost didn't let my Democratic co-sponsor in the House be the sponsor to get it over the finish line. But we ended up sort of working through that and had several of our Republican members sign on. We had, we worked with the Department of Agriculture, the administration, and worked with sort of the groups that aren't really there for party issues. And it's like almost anything. It's about building a coalition, and you've got to make sure that your coalition is not just people that live in highly dense urban areas, right? You've got to make sure that you've got a broader coalition, and I think the fact that this was so supported by farmers was a huge benefit for this particular piece of legislation.
Sure, and obviously there's no time like the present to act and to get something as important as this done. But at least as a concept, has any legislation comparable to this existed in the past?
So I'm not familiar with anything that's been legislated in this space before.
Yeah, I didn't think there was.
And so I think that's part of the reason that the Farmers Market Alliance is pretty pleased to have gotten into this space and had an early success. I think that this is food policy is just it turns out people need to eat, and that actually ends up being something that really does matter from a policy standpoint across the board. And I don't think people realize how challenging food access is to so many people in the state. And we have lots of people that live in true food deserts. We have lots of people who really don't have access to, especially to the types of healthy, nutritious foods that we know that we want more and more Tennesseans to be eating, because we on every public health score imaginable, we are on the wrong side. But I think that people kind of have some an antiquated notion about what food insecurity means. They're thinking like 1920s era depression, true, but food insecurity, one of the groups of people that is most affected by food insecurity is college students. And one of a piece of legislation that I passed a year ago was actually just to convene the sort of relevant stakeholders to do studies on food insecurity amongst our college-going population. Because I mean, a lot of people who are leaving home, a lot of people are on their own for the first time, and a lot of the reason that people don't end up sticking with, the first semester, first year at college, or moving and not getting the credentials that would allow them to have a much better trajectories. They just can't afford to maintain the kind of life that they would like to in their college environment. So trying to find real solutions to where those food problems actually occur.
Absolutely, and we kind of looked at the Edge Hill community, the 12 South community surrounding our campus, over the course of this year as a class. We
Oh, really?
digging
That's great.
into this issue. And one of the things we found with regard to food deserts is there's actually the term food apartheid. And the kind of, I guess, the contrast to that was food desert, it just implies that it exists, whereas a food apartheid implies intentionality. It talks about how, I guess, when grocery stores say, well, we don't want to move into that area until it gentrifies or until there's a wealthier population, because they don't want to sell cheaper goods, they want to maximize profit. And then the few grocery stores that do exist in the area will purposefully put, say, buy in bulk items at eye level, so that they're still squeezing the most money out of people and not necessarily thinking about their nutritional value, about their daily intake, because they're a business. And there are fewer and fewer organizations in and around Edge Hill that are doing this work. There were several that we tried to reach out to that simply didn't respond to us, or said we don't kind of have the operation. One of the few organizations that has remained is the store that Brad and Kim Paisley have sponsored.
Right.
That's like on the edge of our campus.
Which is amazing.
Yes, they've been doing great work. And if you haven't volunteered there, just sidebar, you should go volunteer there. It's an incredible place. And we got to talk to Mary Claire, one of the women who kind of runs boots on the ground for the store, and she talked about the need for further help from, say, the government, from elected leaders, because a lot of the work that they're doing is solving the problem until the next day. They're feeding people until their next meal, but it's not. It's bandaging a bullet hole, and it's not creating a longer term solution. So, not to put you on the spot, but if elected mayor, what would you maybe be prepared to do to look at that? And I understand that this is a much larger issue that isn't going to have maybe an individual. This is how we fix it. But
no, well, I think that you got to be. Look, we're seeing massive growth in this city. Like, it's not hard to. You don't have to look around to notice that, and obviously there's a lot of investment, but I think you have to worry a lot about gentrification in this sense, and a lot about the inequities of investment. And I think the way I think about this is we have to be much more intentional about the way that we're trying to build communities, and to build communities that are economically diverse, right? I think that to a certain extent, you do have to recognize that you do have to figure out a way for the economic investment to make sense. That can be done, right? It's not an impossible business model, but you do have to make sure that the organizations out there that do understand how to provide sort of a healthy grocery that's the right size and capacity and the right business model for those communities, those are people that you need to actually go out and recruit to your community to really try to be in those sort of cornerstone places. And then to a certain extent, you also take advantage of the fact that there are, how do you make sure that a place is, that as some, no one is going to put an absolute stop to gentrification, but you can find ways to harness those forces so that they're not utterly displacing the communities that are in existence, and so that the increased investment doesn't just benefit the newcomers, but is benefiting the entire community that's there.
Sure. And I will say one other thing that was mentioned when I was talking with Mary Claire at the store, was that originally the store was opened on a grant that allowed for a 1-year program, where guests would shop there for a year, and by shop we mean simply get groceries. And at the end of that year, hopefully they would have enough kind of saved up to sort of get back on their feet and get running again.
Right.
The store opened in March of 2020, so they very quickly pivoted. They changed their model, but that was on hiatus. That like 1 year stipulation was kind of on hiatus, and now that has been reinstated, and so they're facing this crisis of like, do we have to drop people from our program because we have to have new enrollment? Like we can't, and so that it just, like you said, it's very complicated. But there are certainly a lot of things that are complicated within the state legislature right now.
Yes.
And
that is an understatement, my friend.
And you did mention earlier, that there's work being done in, the aftermath of the Covenant tragedy. And I will say personally that I appreciated seeing you at the March for Our Lives. I was there. I'm sure other people in this room. Did anybody else march on the Monday, the week after?
Or
a couple of people. Or any of the days? There were like marches every day. Which shows how, I guess, reinvigorated specifically the younger population is, but perhaps more broadly speaking, Nashvilleians and Tennesseans. I know, and this goes kind of like the food insecurity thing. I know there's no individual answer, but I think as students, we need something. How have you addressed this? I know Governor Bill Lee has put out a couple of different statements kind of.
On the Covenant?
Yeah, on Covenant, on gun violence. What can be done? What are you prepared to do?
Well, I mean, so this is unbelievably almost. This is the third mass shooting in the city of Nashville while I've been representing it in the legislature. And the first two were in my district. This one was 200 yards outside of the district that I represent. The first was at a church. The second was at a Waffle House. The third was at this school. And man, I'm telling you, like visiting with some of the families, I haven't met with the families of the victims, but families who were, whose children were in the same third grade class. It's been gutting, right? I mean, and I think I've got a 7-year-old and a 14-year-old, but you don't have to have kids to know that, to feel, I mean, I just think this story just makes you feel a hole in your stomach, right? Like it's painful to even think about. But in all three of these mass shootings, each of the perpetrators was known to their family, to law enforcement, or to both as someone who posed a risk of harming themselves or others. So the Waffle House shooter had actually had his guns confiscated from him in another state, but was totally legal to have them in Tennessee. The Burnett Chapel perpetrator, his father called the police because he was suicidal. The police, I think, concurred, but didn't have any ability to do anything about it. And then the Covenant school shooter was ongoing, in the midst of being treated for a mental health care condition, and the parents did not want their child to be armed. But in none of these instances was there anything to do about it. And so the most obvious sort of response policy-wise to this is I think the language probably that people are using the most is called an extreme risk protection order, which allows a family member or a mental health professional or someone, a school administrator, to basically make a referral to law enforcement. Law enforcement makes sure that there is due process, but if they pose a risk of harming themselves or others, then we actually don't let them have guns and we don't let them acquire an arsenal, which seems like a pretty good common sense thing to do to me. And I think it's a common sense thing to do that 70% of people in Tennessee think we should do. Red states, blue states, all sorts of folks have done this. Florida has done it, Indiana, and it's demonstrably decreases firearm suicide rates, and at the very least creates a possibility for us to stop someone who, is in a sort of the crisis and going towards committing some massive act of violence. At least gives us a possibility of trying to prevent those. So to me, that is what we should be working on. We should be working on a few other things too. So all year I've been working on something that just requires better storage for weapons. the number, I think firearm thefts from cars have gone up like 700% in Tennessee since we passed some law that says, yeah, you can carry your gun in your car. Well, that doesn't mean you should leave your gun in your car, right? So I grew up, I'm a little bit of redneck, right? Like, I grew up in West Tennessee. Like, I grew up around guns. And I can't imagine taking your personal security so seriously that you purchase a gun, but taking it so not seriously that you leave it outside. To what is it, like you want this to be a fair fight? Dumbest. Like, it's unbelievable that people do this, but they, by God, do. And so, but trying to just bring some, common sense to this space around that, and then I would also close the kind of background check loophole, right? I mean, you can go if you told me after this that I told you that I had an AR-15 in the car, and you said I'd like to buy your AR-15. Like, we could go out to my car and I could sell it to you, and I would never go through a background check. You could be a felon, you could be, unquestionably psychotic, and as long as I don't know, I can totally legally sell it to you, and you can totally. And I mean, I don't know if they can and if they don't know, I think they can legally buy it. But effectively, we just let those people get firearms too. We have some sensible laws that say if you're a felon, you can't get a firearm. Having a few more just common sense rules there would be great. I'm very, there's a glimmer of hope that we're trying to push into a window of opportunity right now. That window is closing fast, right? I mean, the legislature is going to adjourn in the next week. I think that many people do not want to get anywhere near this. They want to get out of town without taking action. They're going to, sit out I think there are going to be several thousand people that will come to the Capitol on Monday afternoon. On Tuesday, there's going to be a human chain. You should sign up online if you care about this issue. A human chain from Covenant to the Capitol, sort of demonstrating the community's commitment to supporting something common sense. And even the governor, who has never been for any sort of firearms legislation like this, has come out in support. Some people have indicated openness, but there's a lot of opposition and a lot of attempt to get out of town without doing anything.
Well, and I think
so
also,
if you want to be involved, good time to be involved.
Absolutely. And I do think also, as for as many people as there are who are, like you said, trying to get out of town, trying to duck the issue, it's optimistic to hear that there are those who are, trying to address it. But then obviously there are those who are trying to actively not address it, not just by getting out of town. We saw 2 members get expelled last week, and obviously that made national news. I'm sure a lot of you heard about that. And it's optimistic to hear that there's people addressing the issue. It's optimistic to hear that there's pieces of legislation like House Bill 1049 getting passed that are, transforming, perhaps our mentality into something more optimistic.
Yeah.
But then when we read things like this that are just so, undemocratic, lowercase d, how do we feel? What reason should we have to keep the faith? Because if we're out there actively protesting, and they're stripping members of committees and then voting to expel them, as we're telling them not to, what reason does the younger generation have to keep faith? Because I think that's a recurring issue.
Well, I mean, I think this week's a good reason to understand the pessimism, but also to understand the hope, right? I mean, it was an absurd reaction to the House of Representatives in Tennessee has expelled precisely 2 members since 1796 until last week. And let me tell you, there's some other people who've been contenders.
And just for context,
can you say
why those members were
being convicted, or at least being found after a due process to have committed serious felony offenses, right, including sexual assaults, but serious corruption or robbery, or true just criminal conduct. And these are 2 people who, because they were upset that their microphones got cut and they weren't recognized to talk about a tragedy in their town, they went up front with the microphone and disrupted things for 20 minutes. And so the expulsion was a remarkable overreaction that is I mean, it was embarrassing for the state. It is a dramatic overreaction that has no place in, sort of a democratic society. Regardless of whether you think what they did was appropriate, that's a whole other level of discussion. The expulsion of those two members was genuinely offensive to what the history of the state is, and the sort of clear, the racial undertones were inescapable to see, right? I mean, they're like, it didn't take a lot of people. You don't have to have like a PhD in African American studies to understand like that this does not look like a kosher deal. And so it was, I thought, really embarrassing for the state. That being said, like the outrage and near unanimity in the local governments to not stand for it was remarkable. I mean, I think when they expelled them, they were planning on not letting them come back. But that became impossible because of people. And people were out in the streets. People were calling. People were emailing. It was on national news. We got that attention created this moment for people to really see what was happening. And they reversed course because they were embarrassed. And the business community, the RNCs in town this week, they're embarrassed by them. I mean, you don't want to act like this. And I think that sort of seeing these two young men who really, I think the most, not everybody can stand up in front of a room and be subjected to hostile questioning for an hour and do well. I assure you that of the 132 people in the legislature, very few of them could do as well as Justin Jones and Justin Pearson did, right? I mean, these are, whether you agree with them or not, whether you share their philosophy or not, these are people who have depth of character and breadth of knowledge and strength of conviction. They're not just kind of, and I think that they existed as caricatures in their head. And they weren't seen for the men of substance that they are, and I think that led to, but I think the rest of the country saw that and said, what are you people doing? But look, there are great opportunities, and it's led to increased investment here and increased attention. And I think it's also brought attention on other ways in which democracy has been undermined, right? Because that was so personal and visceral, you could just see it in real time. They're like, oh, you're saying that this whole community doesn't get to have a voice or a vote appear because y'all don't like him? That's not okay. But that's what they do all the time when it comes to gerrymandering. I mean, that's what happens when you sort of take away local control from communities. And so there's all these slightly more abstract ways that they've been cutting back on democracy over the last few years that I think people are starting to connect the dots. And I think, look, most people just don't vote. And so the worst thing that people can do is sort of say, oh, everything's broken, so I'm not going to be part of it. That is, it turns out, not very helpful. If this were the whole state of Tennessee, basically, y'all would be the people under 18. Y'all, some row in the middle would be the new Americans or immigrants or felons who haven't had your voting rights restored. Sorry. And then people who, have never registered to vote. Then this side would be registered, but the people at the very back never voted. So the only people that politicians are talking to would be kind of this half of the room. And really, the back 4 rows, or the middle 4 rows, they only vote in presidential elections. So it's really these 3 rows that vote in gubernatorial elections. And when we're talking about primary elections and local elections, it's basically these 2 folks. And so everybody that matters to elect most mayors, most legislators, it's like talking to these 2 people. And let me assure you that that group does not represent the state. Not only are they older, whiter, wealthier than the state at large, they're also much more ideological and much less open to compromise. And so the reason we can't pass gun stuff, Like in a room full, like if everybody in this room voted except for the kids, sorry, you know, like then, because half the room is for me on extreme risk protection laws. But if I'm running in a Republican primary, I really only care what these two people think. And even if one of them's for it and the other one's against it, then like the savvy political move is to not say anything, right? I mean, it's just like, I'm gonna avoid talking about that because like the little group of people that I care about on election time don't really care. And because the rest of the room doesn't show up in these primary elections or doesn't show up in elections, that's why politics is broken. Like that is the simplest way to think about it right there. And so, because, I mean, look, like if you make it to where politicians need your vote, you will get outcomes. I mean, you've all heard the book Profiles in Courage. I mean, there's a reason that is a short 1-volume work. Like most politicians do what they think they're supposed to do to continue getting elected. And if you've only got to listen to the loudest, most ideological member, most left or most right, people in your community that show up in August primaries because everybody else is just like, oh, I'm gonna vote for my team, like then that's the dysfunction that we're living in right now. How's that?
Yeah. I'm gonna ask you one more, and then if we have time, how are we doing on time? We're good? Okay. Then I'm gonna ask you one more, and then we're gonna open it up if anybody has questions. So be thinking of those if you haven't already. I know you probably kind of touched on this in some of your other answers, but what encourages you to keep going? Because maybe it's easy to say, I've spent 20 years in politics, like this is a good time for me to get out. Or maybe it's a good time, maybe it's easy to say, I haven't seen the changes I'd like to see, or I've seen some of the changes, like, it kind of always seems easier to jump ship than to stay with it. So what, obviously maybe we're motivated by some of the things that we've seen very recently, some of the both undemocratic, actions and the ones that have challenged them, and perhaps that motivates us as a younger generation. But as somebody who's been in the game for a while,
I mean, and it's weird because I think part of the reason that and I do bristle at like thinking it's true at this point. I have been around politics at some point for like that long, but the Tennessee legislature is a part-time job, so like I don't do that even year round, and so like I've always like I'm a lawyer right most of the time, and take my kids to baseball games and don't really think of myself as like in politics all the time. But I do believe in it. But I wouldn't do this if I didn't love it at some level. But in the last 5 years, it's been hard to like it or not be exhausted by it. And if you have that response, that's totally appropriate because you should, because it's exhausting, right? I mean, there's no reason for this stuff to be like that. That doesn't mean that like you shouldn't be part of it. Like when I hear people say like, "Oh, I don't really do politics," I'm like, "All right, like you don't." It's like saying you don't do the weather. Like you do. Like you're living in it. Like you're living in it all the time. Like if and I mean, I think the only difference is like what the theory of this is that we're supposed to govern ourselves, and the only difference between like somebody who's running for office and everybody else is everybody drives down the street and says like they ought to do something about that. Like the only difference is changing that pronoun to like I'm going to do something about that. We're going to do something about that. And I don't encourage anybody to start it, to necessarily do elective office. Though we need many more talented people to do it, and it is deeply rewarding because I am even as crazy a state as we can have, and as terrible as politics has been, like I have passed legislation to make it easier to invest in affordable housing, to improve the laws that protect women against stalking, to improve the law, to create laws that punish people for revenge porn, to make the unemployment system work better so people are less likely to lose their job, to make it more likely that people who have trouble affording things can afford child care, to make advanced academic options available to more diverse communities. I've stopped legislation that would have stopped immigrants from being like arrested on site if they couldn't provide documentation. And then even on things I've lost, I've had the honor to like stand up for people who are getting bullied by, people who have power. And like that is a dang honor. It genuinely is, and there's almost still no way that you can help as many people at once as even I can in a deep minority place in a red state legislature. And so at the very least, like I urge everybody to at least vote, and vote all the time. Like vote in every election. Like just like if they open the polls, go vote. Like just do it. Get in the habit, don't stop, because that's when, and then get to follow enough. Right? Like nobody can save everything about politics. We live in a crazy time, and if it makes you feel better, it's not just us. Like England's broken too. Like there's lots of countries. Look, it's a hard time right now. Like the world is changing in this way where the world that's coming around is different than the one that they grew up in and feel comfortable with. And the world that's coming is one that they don't see a space for them in yet. And it is leading to political conflict. This happens, like it happens historically. But when people give up on the political system, that's when it actually really breaks down. And it's amazing what people are willing to put up with that they could easily change, right? I mean, we showed this week, like, when everybody kind of starts paying attention, we can make the legislature do good things. And that can happen across any number of areas. But to the extent people are interested, like, I think voting is the thing you gotta do. And then I always tell people, find the place where where your gifts or your interests match up with a need somewhere in your community, right? It doesn't matter where that is. And I think if it's on, food access and security, like that's a place to start. And eventually you'll end up, if you go down and try to make a difference there, you'll end up in a politician's office sometime. And if one of them makes you mad enough, run against them, even if it's me, right? I mean it. And like that is the way that this works. And it doesn't, if you're like people get involved in their PTA, or people, get upset because their child was at a school that experienced shooting, and like it changes the trajectory of their lives, and they get involved usually at a small level first and build up, and just find those places to get involved. And I do have a lot of hope that I think we're living through a time when people are pushing back harder and holding on tighter. But I don't think they're doing that because they think they're winning. I think they do it because they know they're losing. And so even though I know that like it's going to be dumb when I walk inside the building a lot of days, I don't think the world is actually getting worse. I think people are better than our political system. And if the people were more involved in our political system, the political system would be better too.
Yeah, I love that answer. That's actually really, really optimistic, and I appreciate that. And we're now going to open it up. I don't know.
Come on.
I know we've kind of talked about a lot of different topics, but feel free if there's anything that you want. Yeah.
As someone who's running for mayor of Nashville, what do you think the most pressing issues within Nashville are right now, and what would be your solutions for those?
Yeah, so I think the challenges of being in a city that's growing at this kind of exponential rate is the challenge of the day. And I think that it's not difficult to see that the infrastructure and services and security like haven't quite kept up. And so if we don't actually keep those things keep up, then I think it's like we're sacrificing our quality of life in order to grow. And it's not going to remain a great city for investors or for jobs if it's not a great city to live first. And I think you got to put a real focus back on the quality of life. I think you got to put a real focus on, I went and toured City Hall during one of the New York mayor's times, and they had like the board up on the front wall that had their 311 or hub system that showed like when pothole calls were coming in and when out street lights were coming in. And I think that we have to be much more focused on responding to those issues so much more quickly to build back some trust that the city can actually make investments and keep up. I also think that you've got to figure out a way to make the investment in transit and sidewalks and childcare for these things that make societies work like that. We've got to make sure that those are keeping up with the pace of incoming human beings, and I think that's a lot of what the work is. I also think right now one of our biggest challenges is dealing with the fact that the state government is a hopeful partner and potential obstacle on every issue in the city. So we want public safety, we want a great public education, we want sound housing policy and economic development policy, but the state is a potential obstacle for that in all cases. And sort of being somebody who's worked in that state side for the last decade, I think I'm sort of uniquely situated to try to navigate and try to get us back into a place where we're building more partnerships than we are fighting fights.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was a great question. Thank you.
Yeah.
Is there anybody else?
Anybody else? Anybody? Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess when it comes to the expulsion, I think we all have seen it, and I think we all realize that there are many different other avenues the House could have taken other than expulsion, censorship or something
Right.
like that. So when it comes to those decisions, could you shine a light on how it comes to when it comes to leadership in the House and the Senate, how it comes to making those actions, as a party, whether it comes to
I don't know. It's a little so I think some of this has been building up over the the legislature has a long relationship with Justin Jones. He was was protested actively before he was elected. Led a 60-day sit-in in which he was the state tried to have him prosecuted in the midst of that, and then he's been elected and doesn't play by the same sort of rule book that they want and doesn't defer to them in the way that they would like, right? And I think that it's been building up, and I think that when this happened, they just lost it. There's an audio recording that came out yesterday that is remarkably revealing and disturbing, frankly, to sort of we're at war, and the Democrats are trying to, they're trying to take over Tennessee, and if Tennessee falls, then the Republic will fall. Just to put this in context, if we won 10 seats, in the Senate, we would still be in the minority, right? We're not in this place of gonna wrestle and kick them out to the curb by any stretch. And so, but I think the most dangerous thing has happened in recent years on the right. And I love Republicans, by the way. I couldn't go home for Thanksgiving if I didn't love some Republicans. But but I do think that there's a strain in the party which has made everything is an emergency. Everything is an existential conflict, and everybody's got to be loyal to our team to drum beat out the people who are not on our side. And I actually try to say this to both, regardless of whether I'm talking to liberals or conservatives, if your plan for making things better requires defeating 30 to 40% of America, it's a bad plan, right? And I count that if your plan for, if you're a liberal, is we just gotta stop worrying about those people. No, that's not how this works. We're all here together, and we gotta figure this out and gotta find some grace towards each other a little. But I don't think of my job, I'm a Democrat, no question, and but I don't represent only Democrats. I represent everybody in my district. That's my job. And that's how everybody should see these political jobs. And I think we've let them become warfare jobs. And, so I like to fight, obviously. I'm a lawyer, right? So, my kids fight at home. But like, literally, the theory of America and our law and government is that fighting over things will make the outcomes better. That really is. Like, that's, most countries, like, they have a judge that hears like evidence and makes a decision, and like, they don't require there to be fights in front of them to figure it out. Like in countries that don't have robust democracies, they just try to figure out what the people in power think is the right answer, and they quietly impose it. We think that big public fights are actually the way that we get to the right outcome, which means that you're supposed to be able to fight with people constructively. And I'll end on like my favorite like random story about politics. So Steve Jobs gave us a speech like to one of Rupert Murdoch's companies. I think it was like the full big News Corp or 20th Century Fox, and he did a poolside with Rupert Murdoch afterwards and said, you know, you're really blowing it with Fox News because you think that the big fight going forward is the fight between the left and the right, when the big fight in the years ahead is between the constructive and the destructive, and you've set your lot with the destructive side. And I think that's really right. And across, whether it's a Democrat or Republican or independent or whatever, if I see that somebody's trying to play some constructive role, there's always something you can work on together. And like, I have worked with people that I disagree with vehemently on so many, you know, who we share so few values, but we still find ways to work together. And like, that's how this is supposed to work. And it's doing so like that makes you recognize that the person you're fighting is not your enemy, right? Because that's not a healthy place for us to be. So we have to learn how to fight better and not write people off as a society.
Guys, give a round of applause to the senators.